me, i24 news correspondent in London, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, thank you for joining us this morning.
Good to be with you.
Of course, the Israeli leadership and Hamas leadership are also looking at the international community and also at the international media. What trend has been adopted by the international media? What's on the Sunday Times this morning?
Well, the front page of the Sunday Times this morning carries a startling headline for most people in Britain. It says, "Anti-Semitic attacks scar British cities." And it goes on to detail some of the many anti-Semitic attacks taking place now in Britain, which include all sorts of hideous attacks that people weren't expecting ever to re-emerge in Europe. Those range from simply banners in these regular anti-Israel protests going on in the United Kingdom at the moment, saying things like Hitler was right and Hamas, Jews to the gas, are chants regularly heard in these sorts of events. And along with those sorts of things, the most serious incidents listed by the Sunday Times include a BBC journalist who's been reprimanded after appearing to suggest that Western politicians had failed to intervene in the Middle East crisis because they had been bought by the Jews. A rabbi who was attacked by 4 youths outside a Jewish school in Gateshead, bricks being thrown through the window of Northern Ireland's only synagogue on 2 consecutive nights, a group of Asian men who drove through a Jewish area of Greater Manchester, leaning out of their windows, shouting Heil Hitler and hurling missiles at pedestrians, a man on Twitter who called for a Jewish neighborhood in London to be bombed so that Jews could, quote, feel the pain of the Palestinians, and on and on and on. In fact, police say that the reports of anti-Semitic attacks have increased enormously during this operation. And what most fear is that these sorts of hideous banners, chants and signs, as well as the actual attacks, is not something new at all, and not really something related to Israel, but simply that the current news has given people carte blanche to say these things out on the streets that have always been there, and now nobody is really doing very much about it.
And Jonathan, when you compare London to Paris, which Paris has seen maybe overwhelmingly much more even violent protests compared to London, do you believe that London is now, quote unquote, catching up to the intensity of the protests that we've seen in Paris? And we saw pictures from Paris over the weekend of swastikas and so forth on monuments.
Indeed, and you know what's happening in Paris with the swastikas on the monuments and with much more violent attacks on the synagogue there, even than those happening in the United Kingdom, is something which is terrifying to Jews in the United Kingdom. It's no exaggeration to say that people in Britain are looking across the channel and wondering when this will spread to Britain. And in fact, what is going on in Britain at the moment is not so far removed. Some of the violence may be less declared and less obvious, but the fact remains that even in Paris, when the foreign ministers of the world were there discussing this, this swastika is painted onto monuments, and the attacks on the synagogues in the last couple of weeks have shown that Jews are not only not particularly safe, but that the authorities are either unable or unwilling to protect them. In Paris, they banned one of the pro-Palestinian marches after the violence that erupted the week before, and yet when it took place, very little seems to have happened in order to stop it and to protect the Jewish community there.
And we've spoken throughout this operation about the British leadership and its reaction to the operation, both, of course, on the diplomatic level, but now with this headline in the Sunday Times, do you believe you will be hearing different rhetoric from Parliament in Westminster?
For once, this issue seems to be coming out into the open. The front page of the Sunday Times yesterday on Sky News, a debate about this very issue of rising anti-Semitism, and perhaps an increasing awareness that this isn't really about Israel at all. Israel is the hook on which these people are hanging their anti-Semitic cloak. They've always had these feelings inside. There has been a rising anti-Semitism that Jews in the country have always put up with, say Jewish leaders who I've spoken to. And now they feel that at least this is being discussed. But once again, the fear is that even with the strong support from Westminster, from David Cameron, from Philip Hammond and others for the Israeli actions in Gaza at the moment, even with that strong support, it seems that the government is willing to treat this rise in anti-Semitism as something which is shocking and terrible, but which they feel is a byproduct of what is happening in Israel. And many Jews worry that they won't be taking it seriously enough as a consequence, that really there's something rotten at the core which needs dealing with, and that Israel isn't the issue here. The anti-Semitic attacks are quite separate from Israel. And whether or not people like or dislike what's going on in Gaza and what Israel is doing in the region, the Jewish community here feels that actually the government ought to be protecting them regardless from any kind of physical, violent attack or threat.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, our i24 news correspondent there in London, thank you for that report this morning. Of course, we will be getting updates from you throughout this week. Again, thank you for joining us. I want to thank my panelists. We will be back after the short break, and we'll take up this discussion from this point exactly. We're going to go for a short break, and we'll be right back.